Are you ready to learn UV unwrapping in Blender? Hey guys, in this free Blender course, I've reorganized my UV unwrapping course for beginners into this one video. And I've also added a few things in to make this course as easy to follow as possible. That way, you can get started with learning UV unwrapping inside of Blender, as unfortunately this is a 3D skill that scares a lot of people using Blender. But it honestly isn't too difficult to understand once you understand the basic principles, which in this course I've done my absolute best to teach you. If you don't know what UV unwrapping is, it is essentially the process of taking our 3D model, cutting it up and turning it into a 2D form. Now that sounds quite harsh, but it's actually very important. The reason we flatten out our 3D model like this is because image textures work in 2D, and they require us to translate our 3D model into a 2D form in order for the texture to be placed properly. Unless of course you want your textured model to look something like this. In this course we're going to be covering the UV unwrapping fundamentals through episodes 1 to 8. In this one, we will learn how to UV unwrap and memorize the UV unwrap for cubes and cylinders, as pretty much anything you unwrap can be broken down into a combination of cubes and cylinders. You will also learn some of the most essential knowledge to know to get the hang of the UV editor, and you will learn what UV islands are. So don't worry if all of these concepts are very new to you, as we will be covering them in depth in this course. Then through episodes 9 to 18, we'll be UV unwrapping to the next level. In this section of the course, you'll be learning the vital tools used to speed up the workflow for UV unwrapping in Blender, and you'll also be learning some more essential knowledge to mastering UV unwrapping in Blender and getting some pretty good results. Apart from that quick overview though, let's go ahead and get started. I hope you enjoy the course. Today I'm going to be showing you guys the two main types of cube UV unwraps that you will probably use in Blender. One of them is made using the process of UV unwrapping, and another one is created much quicker. First though, in order to see what our UV looks like, we're first going to need to left click our object to select it, and then I'm going to come to the top left hand corner of the 3D viewport, which is this menu here, and where the cross appears I'm just going to left click and drag, and that's going to pull out another 3D viewport. Like any menu, you can change this by left clicking the button in the top left hand corner to change the editor type. I can then change it from 3D viewport to UV editor. This here is our UV window, and this will show us our UV. Right now we can't see it because we need to go into edit mode first. So I'm going to come back and move my mouse over to the 3D viewport where my cube is and press tab to go into edit mode. By default everything will be selected, but if you haven't got anything selected just press A, and now we can see our UV here. This here is the default UV, and it's the one that we would usually make using the UV unwrapping process. Before I explain what this UV is good for, I'm going to show you how to make it, because this will be important for UV unwrapping other objects that have a cube-like shape. First though, I'm going to mess it up. So back in edit mode, I press A to select everything, then I'm going to press U, and think of it as U for UV unwrapped menu. And here we've got a few different options. I'm just going to choose as project from view to just use a totally incorrect UV for this example. As some of you will know, UVs are used for a variety of different texturing processes, and that's why UV unwrapping is relevant in the first place. I'm going to press 2 to go into edge select mode, and I'm going to just start selecting some edges. The edges I select here, I'm going to create a seam on. All a seam is think of it as like cutting through the edge with a scissors to create a 2D form of our shape in the UV window here. If I right click and choose mark seam, then press A, U, and then unwrap. Right now we'll have nothing because I think this is a little bit too difficult for Blender to calculate. But you can see if I now left click this edge here, maybe shift left click this one, right click mark seam, and then press A for all, U, and then unwrap, you can see it's now starting to flatten out the cube. You can see this face here that we've added the free edges to has been nicely separated from the object. But we don't want to add cuts everywhere. This goes into why we want this cross shape in the first place, and not just a bunch of squares. The cross shape will allow us to reduce the amount of seams when using just a basic square texture like this. This is important if you're downloading 4K PBR textures from online or something similar. However, what this isn't relevant for, or not as relevant at least, would be texture baking and texture painting. I'll explain later why these ones won't be as relevant, although sometimes I would UV unwrap an object for doing these processes if it's complex enough and wouldn't suffice with a smart UV project, which is the other type of unwrap we'll be covering today. Now we need to figure out how to turn this cube into a cross in the UV workspace. So right now we've cut off the top face, so you could think of this face here as like a flap that's coming up. Next we want two flaps to come out from the side, so to do that we would need to make two cuts here and here. So I'm going to left click this edge here and then shift left click this edge here, and you can right click, make sure you're in edge select mode for this, and choose mark seam. If you're not in edge select mode, you can also press Ctrl E to open up the edge menu. Here you can find the mark seam option as well. You can also clear seams to remove them. Now if I press A, U, and then unwrap, you can see we're getting closer to what we're looking for, but we still need to cut the cube on these two edges here. You'll notice though, if I select the edge here, it won't select it here. And if you want to do that to make it a little bit easier, you can enable this mode here. And now when I select the edge here, it selects it here also. This can be easier for better understanding where cuts need to be made in the beginning. Select those two edges, and then I'm going to press Ctrl E this time to open the edge menu, and then choose Mark C. Then I'll press A, U, and then Unwrap. And now you can see we've got our cross shape. It's upside down, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to press Tab to go back into object mode. Another thing you'll encounter with more customized objects, like a rectangle for example, is not applying the scale. For example, if I press S and X to scale this along, then press Tab to go into edit mode, A, U, and then Unwrap, you can see we've still got square faces here, even though we're working with a cuboid now. So I'm going to press Tab to go back into object mode, and what I actually need to do was apply the scale first. So you do this in object mode, so I'm going to press Ctrl A, which will open the apply menu, then I'm going to choose scale. Then I can press Tab to go back into edit mode, A to select all again, then I can press U, and then choose Unwrap. And now you can see we've got our cross shape, but this time it's got the cuboid shape we're looking for. So that's how we can UV unwrap an object using seams, which again is great for using like square textures, as it reduces the number of seams. We can also use this form of UV unwrapping for more complex objects, which the next method won't work too well with, for texture baking and texture painting too. Let's get started on learning the other method. I'm just going to press X and then delete my cube. Then I'll press Shift A, and then under Mesh I'm going to choose Cube. This time I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode, A to select everything, then I'm going to press U and then choose Smart UV Project. Here another menu will come up which will give us some options. I'm going to set my island margin to 0.01. The island margin is how much space there is between each square. This is important to prevent any strange overlapping, especially in different texture sizes. I'll then press OK, and now you can see we have this unwrap here. You can see all these squares are separated, so if we were to apply a basic square texture to this, there would be visible seams everywhere. Again though, if I was going to make this a cuboid, or changing the scale in any way, you need to make sure to unwrap it again by applying the scale in object mode, going back into edit mode, and unwrapping again. I briefly touched on it earlier, but this type of UV unwrap is a little bit more optimized for, first of all, texture baking, which is the process of taking a material, for example, procedural material you made, and turning it into an image texture. This will save you more time than UV unwrapping with seams, and is actually more optimized since the squares are bigger than on the cross. If you don't know what texture baking is, I do have a full free course on the subject, which you can check out in the description below after this video. Another thing we would use this type of unwrap for would be texture painting. This is because when we paint a texture in Blender, we can paint it directly onto the object, which means the seams won't be visible, since as far as Blender is concerned, there's no separation when you're painting on the object. However, if you were to paint in this menu, you may find some more issues. So if you wanted to paint in this menu here, then maybe it won't work as well. As I mentioned earlier though, although this unwrap is great for a cube, for more complex objects, sometimes you will need to do the first method of UV unwrapping with seams in order to prevent a really messy result, even with texture painting and texture baking. This is because when you UV unwrap a complex object with Smart UV Project, you can get crazy results like this. However, for this simple object, it works just fine and actually ends up being more optimal for the texture baking and texture painting process. But for example, this low poly character, which I texture painted a while back, I made sure to UV unwrap it using seams to prevent a really messy result. It can also help sometimes to make everything a little bit clearer to understand what I'm painting and where, especially if you're going to pull things into another painting software like Krita, for example, which is another cool free software but for painting. But yeah, that's like a good introduction to UV unwrapping in Blender. As I've discussed in previous videos on UV unwrapping, the main two important types of UV unwraps are cubes and cylinders. But actually remembering how to unwrap these things is usually done by just practicing it over and over again. But as someone who studies a lot of theory-based subjects, I like to come up with memorable analogies to try and memorize things a little bit quicker. So today I'm going to show you an easy way to try and remember how to unwrap cube or cuboid objects. As always, before we unwrap an object, we're going to first apply the scale. So in object mode, I'm going to left click it, press Ctrl A, and then choose scale. This is just in case we made any adjustments to it in object mode. Although of course this is a simple cube so we haven't done anything, but it's still good practice nonetheless to keep the habit up. Then I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode, then I'm going to make sure I press 2 on the keyboard so I'm in edge select mode, which will allow me to select edges. Now I can go into this memorable analogy I told you about. So I want you to imagine the letter U. Think of it as U for unwrap, and what we're going to do to this U is kind of square it out so it becomes a really straightened out U shape. Imagine a U on a digital clock or something like that. And essentially to unwrap a cube we just need to have 3 of those U's in a row connected together like this. and that will allow us to create that cross shape we're looking for. So technically there's 4 U's in total, because when we wrap it around the cube, it creates a 4th U as well. But just remember it as getting 3 of these squarish U's in a row. So let's go ahead and put this into practice. I'll left click my edge down here, and I'm going to shift left click these edges here, and then I'm going to right click and then choose mark seam, and you can see that has marked our first U. You can see it's rotated so it looks more like a C. Then I'm going to shift left click these edges here, right click, mark seam, and there you go. You can now see we have 2 U's together. So remember, now we've got 2 of our U's back to back, and then we're just going to get our last one here by left clicking this edge here, shift left clicking this edge here, right click and mark seam, and now you can see we have 3 U's in a row. And of course I mentioned it would create a 4th U, which you can see here, but just think of it as creating these 3 U's in a row. Then I'm just going to press A, U, and then unwrap, and you can see this cube's already been unwrapped, but it's unwrapped it to our cross shape here. Let's practice with one more example just to show that it works on any kind of cuboid object. So I'm going to press tab to come back into object mode. I'll left click my cuboid here, and first we'll apply the scale before we do any unwrapping. So press Ctrl A to open the apply menu, and then choose scale. Then I'll press tab to go into edit mode, and it doesn't really matter which way you do it, so let's do it this way this time. So I'm going to left click this edge here, shift left click this edge here, and then shift left click this edge here, and this time I'll press Ctrl E to open the edge menu, but you can right click as well, and then choose mark seam. Then I'm going to shift left click this edge here and this one here, and that's going to make a really long U here. I'll then right click and then choose mark seam. Finally, I'm just going to come to the end here and left click this edge here, shift left click this edge here, right click, and then choose mark seam. Then I'll press A, U, then unwrap, and you can see we've got our cross unwrap here, and it's been unwrapped nicely. And yeah, I thought I'd share that simple way to remember how to unwrap cube or cuboid shapes. So again, just remember it is that 3 U's in a row. Last time, we learned how to UV unwrap a cube in 2 different ways. One using seams, which is your standard, most preached form of UV unwrapping, and through Smart UV Project, which is more optimal for optimizing texture space and works best with texture baking and texture painting directly onto the object. Today we're going to be moving on to the cylinder, which is our second fundamental object for UV unwrapping pretty much anything. So I'll press Shift A, then under Mesh, I'm going to left click Cylinder. Might also right click and choose Shade Smooth by Angle, just to make it look a little nicer. You can see that smoothed out those hard edges. Then again, I'm going to come up to my top left hand corner, and when this cross appears, I'm just going to left click and drag, and you'll see another 3D viewport, which are these menus here, will appear. Like in any menu, we can click the top left hand button, and this allows you to change the editor type. And I can just change this to UV editor. If I come back to my 3D viewport here and just press tab to go into edit mode and press A to select everything, you can see we've got a nice UV here by default. As in the last video, we looked at the Smart UV Project and seam-based UV unwrap. So first, I'll show you what the Smart UV Project will look like. So I'm going to press U, then I'm going to choose Smart UV Project. I'm going to make sure I set my island margin here to 0.01 and then just press OK. And you can see it's separated our object into these different islands. If you're in a hurry and you just really want to quickly unwrap a cylindrical object, this can be a great way to do it. However, you'll notice a lot of these islands are separated, which again wouldn't be very good for texturing with a square texture, such as this wood texture appearing on the screen just now. But for texture baking and texture painting directly onto the object, this object is simple enough for this to be okay. Now I'm going to show you the method, and that's going to be the seam unwrapping method. So if you remember in the last video, we talked a little bit about what seams are. Seams are essentially just selecting some edges, and then we're marking them as cuts. Obviously this isn't going to cut the object in this 3D viewport here, but rather it's going to cut it up in this UV editor here, as essentially we're turning this object into a 2D form, so like flattening it out, a bit like a paper craft before it's made. If you ever done those paper dice in school, you'll know kind of what I'm meaning. That's why our cube in the last video had a cross shape, a bit like one of those dice cubes. You'll notice right now though, if I press 2 in the keyboard to go into edge select mode, select one of my edges, we can't see anything here. To fix that, we can left click this button here, which allows us to, when we select an edge in one of these menus, it'll select it in the other. To start off, I'm going to want to select my 2 circles at the top and the bottom. So I'm going to press Alt left click, so it's going to allow me to select the entire loop. Then, this will allow me to cut off my top face, which is necessary to flatten out this object. Then I'm going to press Shift Alt left click and select the bottom one. Then, if you remember, when we're in edge select mode, all we need to do is right click and then choose
mark seam. Nothing will happen straight away because we still need to unwrap our object. So I'll press A, U, and then choose unwrap. Right now you can see our circles have worked fine, but the middle bit has been really distorted here, and that's because it's pretty hard to flatten this out without actually making a cut. So to fix this, very simple. All we need to do is pick any of these edges. Usually it's best to go for one which would not be visible to the viewer of your render. For example, if the camera was pointing the way I am now, I'd probably want to select an edge round at the back here. That way the visible seam won't be visible in the render. But sometimes you have no choice but to show the visible seams. This is one downside of using the kind of square based texturing technique. Of course, you don't have to worry about this though if you're doing texture baking or texture painting directly onto the object. Now I've selected my edge, I can either right click and choose mark seam again, or I can press Ctrl E, which will bring up the edge menu, and this works in any type of selection tool in edit mode, such as vertex select mode. And then I'm just going to left click mark seam. Then I can press A, U, and then unwrap. And now you can see it's flattened everything out. As you'll notice, this looks nicer and will be much better for the square based texturing I mentioned. But there's one thing we actually forgot to do. Thankfully, it's already added a margin, but we should always double check when we have more than one island. In the last video with the cube, it was all one island, so it wasn't as important. But this time it is. So I'm just going to press A, U, and then unwrap, and you'll see this little menu in the bottom appears. So I'm going to open it up, and here it says margin. You're just going to want to make sure you set it to something like 0.01. As you'll notice, our Smart UV project earlier was a little bit bigger. So in that case, it would be more optimized for texture baking and texture painting directly onto the object. However, for using with square based texture, this would be the most optimal method. This of course will be important for UV unwrapping more complex objects as well, which may be necessary for texture baking and texture painting as well, as more complex objects will struggle more with the Smart UV project. I'm going to press tab to come back into object mode here, and I'm going to show you another common problem which we covered last time, but just in case you're new, I'm going to press S and then Y and just scale this cylinder on the Y axis. Now if I press tab to go into edit mode again and press A for all, U for unwrap, and then choose unwrap, you'll see nothing changes, even though this should be much more oval-like. This is because we didn't apply the scale. This happens when you make adjustments in object mode and don't apply them. So to fix that, I'm going to come back into object mode, which you can just choose here, or you can press tab, and then I'm going to press Ctrl A for the apply menu and just choose scale. Then when I press tab to go back into edit mode, press A to select all again, press U to open the unwrap menu, and then choose unwrap. Now you can see we've got the distortions we were looking for. Last time, I showed you a simple way to remember how to unwrap a cube. Today though, I'm going to show you a memorable analogy for the cylinder this time, which is our second fundamental object to know how to unwrap, to pretty much unwrap anything. For this one, I like to think of Harry Potter glasses. So you can imagine a circle with a line between it and then another circle. And you can imagine that Voldemort's taken those glasses and snap them to kind of create that 3D shape of a cylinder. So let's put this into practice. First, I'm going to left click my cylinder. I'm going to press Ctrl A. The reason I'm doing this is because I need to apply the scale first, just in case I've made any edits in object mode, and this will make sure that we have the right proportions once we UV unwrap. So I'll choose scale by left clicking it, and then I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode so we can start unwrapping. I'll press 2 on the keyboard to go into edge select mode, and we're going to select the first part of our Harry Potter glasses, which is going to be this top face. So I'll alt left click this edge loop here to select it. Then I'm going to shift select one edge down the middle, and this is going to be the kind of bit that holds the two lenses together. Then I'm going to go down to the bottom here, press shift alt, and then left click this edge loop here to select our other lens. And the whole snapping thing I made was pretty much me just explaining how rather than straight glasses, the two lenses have been snapped down by 90 degrees. Then I can just right click and then choose mark seam. Then all that's left to do is press A to select everything, U to open the unwrap menu, and press unwrap. And now you can see we've got our cylinder unwrapped here. And all we need to do is open this unwrap menu here and select a margin since we have more than one island here. An island is just one of these individual sets of one or more faces. I'm going to set the margin to 0.01 and press enter. And now we've got a nice little bit of space between each island, which is essential to avoid any issues. And yeah, that's about it. I thought I'd share that quickly just to show you another memorable analogy for unwrapping cylinders. This one's definitely the easier one of the two when compared to cubes, but still useful to know nonetheless.
Now we've covered how to UV unwrap a cube and a cylinder, our two most fundamental unwraps to learn. I'm going to be covering a third option for UV unwrapping a cube. This is a great option for using with seamless square textures, such as this brick texture or this wood texture from CG Bookcase. To get started, we will need a cube. So I'm going to press Shift A, then under Mesh, I'm going to choose Cube. Then I'm going to come up to the top left hand corner, and when this cross appears, I'm just going to left click and drag. Then I'm going to left click my editor type here, which is this button in the top left left hand corner and change it to UV editor. And now you can see my 3D viewport has been changed into this UV workspace. And when I press tab to go into edit mode in my 3D viewport here, we can see we've got our default cross UV. First though, let's apply our texture. I'm just going to left click and drag this here, and I'm going to press tab to go back into object mode. You can see we've got this option here, which will allow us to see any shader changes we make. Then I'm going to left click and drag this back across, just to keep things nice. I'm going to change my clock here, or timeline, to the shader editor, and then I'm just going to press plus new to add a new material. Then I'm going to press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to choose image texture. I'm then going to press open, and I'm going to come to my textures folder on my computer, where I've downloaded this brick textures from CG Bookcase. I'll leave the link in the description. All you'll need to do once you download it is right click the zip file and press extract all. Then in that folder, you will have all your textures. For now, I'm going to left click this base color here, and just press open image. Then I'm going to press Shift A, and then under input I'm going to choose texture coordinate. This allows us to choose how our image is mapped onto our cube. The default is UV, so we technically didn't need to add this, but I think it's good practice to improve your understanding of how input coordinates are working here. So I'm going to plug my UV into the vector, then color into the base color. Now essentially what's happening here is if I press tab to go into edit mode, you can see our square is being placed here, and our cross here is deciding where the texture will appear on our object. But this texture here is seamless, which means it can be repeated over and over again. For that reason, we want to have each face cover the entire surface of the texture. To do that, it's very simple. I'm going to press A in edit mode here to select all my faces, U, and then I'm going to choose, instead of Smart UV Project, I'm going to choose a cube projection. Now you can see, if I press 3 on the keyboard and select one of my faces, you can see each face is taking up the entire size of this square. And now we've got nice repeating texture all across. Of course, if you want to change the size of this, I can press A to select everything, then come to my UV editor here and press A to select everything, and press S, and I can change the scale maybe to like 0.5 by pressing 0.5 to half it. And now you can see the bricks are a little bit bigger. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that, because maybe you don't want to alter the scale and then try and remember how to change it back later. So instead, we can come down to our nodes here, and I can press Shift A, then under vector, I can choose mapping, plug this in between here, and where it says scale here, I can just left click and drag these values down and do the same thing by typing in 0.5 for half. And now we've got the exact same result, but we haven't had to change anything in our UV editor. So this makes it much easier to control. You can of course make it bigger too by changing the scale to something like 2. And if you wanted our brick texture to look like this, but have it as its own bake texture, you could bake this as well. Do keep in mind though, as you scale up an image, you will be losing some detail. But that is the nature of using image textures rather than mathematically generated. Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about UV islands, which is an important concept to understand in UV unwrapping. And some people don't actually know what people are referring to when they say UV islands. It's actually quite simple, and there's only a couple of things we need to cover. So let's just get into it. Here you can see I've UV unwrapped this object using just seams, and here is my result. So as you might understand, this whole thing here is the UV map. Something we won't get into today is that you can actually have more than one UV map, but this is a more complex topic that we'll cover in a later video in this series. Here you can see all these separate components which represent faces on this object here, which we have decided using these red lines or seams. If you don't understand what seams are, they're pretty much just like cuts on the object to turn it into these 2D shapes. However, I would recommend checking out the earlier videos in this series to get a better understanding of how seams are actually working. I'll leave the link in the description below to the playlist for all these UV unwrapping videos. And they will start from beginner to more of these more late beginner, early intermediate concepts. Each of these collection of one or more faces that are separated out are what we call UV islands. And the reason they need to be separated in the first place, as you know, is because we need to flatten out our object into a 2D plane. If I zoom in here, you can see there is a gap between my UV islands. And this gap is really important. What we want to avoid is having an overlap of our UV islands. The reason for this is if we are texture painting or texture baking, which is the process of turning any collection of nodes into an image texture, if there's overlap, it's going to create some issues because it's going to try and either paint or bake in the same place as another part of the model. What I'm going to do though is purposefully create a bit of an overlap to show you how this creates a problem. So first of all, how do we actually select a UV island? To do this, all we need to do is press the L key with our mouse hovering over an island. L stands for link, so we're essentially selecting everything linked to this island. Once you have it selected, you can then press G, and that would allow you to grab it and move it around. You can also use S to scale it or make it bigger or smaller, and R to rotate it. I'm going to press G and do something incorrect by overlapping these two islands here. You can also select your UV islands here in the 3D viewport where our object is. First of all,
we will need to turn on this UV sync selection mode. This will mean if I press free on the keyboard to go into face select mode and select a face in here, you can see it selects it in the UV editor as well. If I turn that off, you can see only the selected face will be displayed, which is a little bit inconvenient most of the time. So I'm going to turn the arrows back on, and if I was to press L, you can see it's automatically selected everything contained within the seam, and it's selected this here. But this won't always be the default. The default would end up just selecting everything, because all of this entire object is connected together. If that happens for you, just in this select linked box, which will open right after pressing L, open it up by pressing the arrow, and here you can see you've got a few options. If I shift left click the seam to turn it back to default, you can see it's selected everything because this object is all connected together, and for the 3D viewport, that's just going to interpret the default of the linked select as just select everything connected. And here you've got a few different options, but the one we're looking for is seam. So I'll left click it again to turn it back on, and you can see it's now going to select everything linked. If I press L again, you can see I can now select this one here. So that's how we can select it in the 3D viewport as well. I'm going to quickly go into texture paint mode, and here I'm going to make sure I'm in my shader editor. You don't need to follow along with this because this isn't a texture painting tutorial. I just want to explain why the UV overlapping is bad. So I'm going to press the plus new, and here I'll press Shift A, and under texture I'll choose image texture. I'll plug my color into the base color, and I'm going to press Shift A, then under input I'll choose texture coordinate and plug the UV into the vector. That just tells us that this image texture, which we're going to paint on, will use the UV map in order to calculate where it's painted. This is essential for texture painting. Then I'm going to press plus new to create a new image, and I'll just leave it at the default and press new image. Just to demonstrate, I'm going to change my editor type here from UV editor to image editor. This will allow us to texture paint in this menu as well. Then we just need to change it from view to paint. And I can select my draw brush here too. Then I can choose my image, which I'm using here, just to match this. And now when I start painting, I'm going to make my brush a bit bigger by pressing F and changing the size. I'll just paint across here. You can see that it's painted both the inside and the outside. And that's because this UV here, representing the inside, is overlapping with this one on the outside, which is going to make it pretty difficult if you're wanting to have different patterns in different areas. I'll just press texture paint, and I'm going to change it back to edit mode, and I'm going to go ahead and delete my texture. I'll then change it back to the UV editor. Hopefully that example gives you a better understanding of why we can't have these overlapping. So I'm just going to press L to select this island again, and press G to move it so it isn't overlapping again. However, it's a little fiddly now because we have to position it, and although it seems to be okay that it's not overlapping, there's a way to automate this process. So as you can see, I've marked all the seams on this object. This should work just fine for a smart UV project as well, but if you have any concerns about your object or you're worried that you've missed a step, it never hurts to duplicate your object first as a backup. Then what I'm going to do is in edit mode I'll press A to select everything or all, and then U to open the unwrap menu and choose unwrap. You can see it's just going to unwrap it back to the default. In my unwrap menu here, you can see that there's a parameter called margin. This one's really important. If I was to set this to 0, while nothing is overlapping, everything is kind of joined together here and there's no separation. This can create issues similar to what I explained before, and that's why it's always better to have just a tiny gap in between. So what I would recommend is 0.01, and that gives a nice gap and should solve the issue for most texture sizes. But if you have any doubts, you can always do some research online to make sure the texture size you're using is using a pretty appropriate margin for Blender. Of course, experimenting yourself will also help you understand what's best. The bigger the gap, the less likely you are to encounter problems. However, the reason we won't want to have a gap too big is so we can optimize the texture space, which although isn't as important in the VFX/film industry, it is very important in the game industry, as we always want to optimize our texture space, as games work in real time and we don't have a million years to render a single frame. So every optimization counts in games. Hey everyone, welcome back to our UV unwrapping series. Today we are going to be learning how to straighten out UVs. So first thing I'm going to do is set up a texture so we can actually see what changes we're making. So first of all, at the start of the video you could see I had a little workspace on the left here, so I'm going to show you how to get that. So I'll come up to the top left hand corner, and where the little cross appears, I'm just going to left to hold and drag, pull this out. Then I'm going to left click this button here and change it to UV editor. When I left click my object and press tab to go into edit mode, you can see this will show our UV here. I'm just going to create a quick unwrap to get started. So I'm going to press 2 in the keyboard to go into edge select mode, and I'll press Alt left click to select this top loop here. Then if you remember how we unwrap cylindrical objects, I'm just going to shift left click one of these edges here, and then I'm going to press shift Alt left click to select this bottom one here. if you're new to unwrapping cylinders and don't know why we're doing this, I recommend checking out my unwrapping cylinders video. Now I've got all my edges selected, I'll press Ctrl E and then I'm going to choose Mark C. Then I can press A to select all, U to open the unwrap menu and press unwrap. Then in the bottom left hand corner of the 3D viewport, the little unwrap menu will be here and I'm going to change my margin to 0.01. Perfect. Now we have our 3 islands. You can see the circles are fine, but this here will create some issues when we're wanting to texture. But first of all, we need to add a texture to actually see. So I'm going to press tab to come back into object mode for now. And I'm going to left click and drag this along just so I can see more of my top bar. And I'm going to go into this viewport shading. Now I'm going to change my clock here, or timeline, to the shader editor so I can create a quick material. I'll press plus new and I'm going to press shift A and then under texture, I'm going to choose brick texture. And I'm just going to plug the color into the base color. And right now you can see how distorted this is looking. Then I'm going to need to tell the brick texture which coordinates to use. So I'm going to press shift A, then under input I'm going to choose texture coordinate. This will allow me to use the UV coordinates in this case, which just takes the information from our UV map and uses that to decide how the texture is displayed. The top and the bottom aren't too bad, but here we want this to be straight, but at the moment it's kind of curved. And if I press tab to go into edit mode, you can see this is happening because this here isn't straight. Thankfully, to fix this is pretty easy. What I'm going to do is choose one of these faces, roughly one in the middle, and I'm going to start off by selecting this edge here. Then I'm going to want to scale it on the y-axis by 0. The y-axis is the up and down one in here. This wouldn't be z in this case for up and down because this is a 2D plane, which only works with x and y. For example, if I press S and then x, you can see that that'll scale it left and right. And if I press S and then y, that would scale it up and down. So what I'm going to do to make it completely straight, I'm going to press S, Y, and then 0. And that will completely flatten it along that y-axis. Then I'm going to select the top one here and press S, Y, and 0. You can see that that's now made both of these straight. If I press Ctrl Z to undo that, I could also right click and choose align horizontally. And notice how that does the same thing. I could also left click this edge here and I'm going to want to scale it on the X axis. So I'll press SX and then 0. That's going to straighten out that one. Then I'll left click the other one and I'll do the align vertical this one. So I'll just right click and then choose align vertically. So you can either scale it on one axis by 0 or you can just use the align vertically or horizontal. Awesome. Now what I'm going to do is press 3 on the keyboard to go into face select mode in my UV editor. I'm going to select my face, the one that I've straightened out, and then I'm going to press L. What L does is selects the linked island. Then I can just right click and then choose follow active quads. And now we have it completely straightened out. We might need to move it, so I'll press G to just move this along. This is to stop any overlap here, which is very important for texture baking or texture painting. Now in our 3D viewport, you can see this is looking much cleaner. Hey everyone, now you guys know how to unwrap cubes and cylinders in Blender, we're going to be covering how to unwrap this more complex object. To follow along, make sure to download the free blend file in the description below so you can follow along with this model. We'll start off by setting up our UV workspace. So I'm going to bring my mouse to the top left hand corner of the 3D viewport where this cross shape will appear. Then I can left click to hold and then drag to bring out a second 3D viewport. Then I'm going to left click the editor type here to change it to UV editor. Right now we won't be able to see anything, so I'm going to come back to my 3D viewport and press tab to go into edit mode and press A to select all. You can see right now, since this object started as a cube, it's just added all of these extra extrusions I made on top. Now we've taken a look at the UV, there's one thing we need to do before we start unwrapping. First, I'm going to press tab to go back into object mode, and to start off, I'll press Ctrl and then A. This is going to open up the apply menu, and it's important that we apply the scale, and we can also apply the rotation by pressing Ctrl A and choosing rotation. The reason we've done this first is because if our scale isn't correct, as I've mentioned in previous UV unwrapping tutorials, the proportions in the UV editor won't match proportions of the actual object. The scale usually gets changed when we scale things inside of object mode, but I always like to apply the scale and the rotation before I UV unwrap just to be safe. I'm now going to press tab to go back into edit mode, and we can start UV unwrapping. To start off, this UV unwrap, this cube part here, and you're going to start to see as we do this that pretty much unwrapping most things is just combining a bunch of cylinder unwraps with cube unwraps. So for a cube, a good thing I like to think to remember it is we're going to have a total of 4 U shapes with our seams. So to start off, I'm going to press 2 on the keyboard to go into edge select mode, and I'm going to select here, going to create our first U by then control left clicking this edge here, control left clicking here, and then control left clicking here. And now you can see this has created a U shape. These here are going to be cut, and that's going to create a nice flap there. Then we can shift left click these edges here, and then control left click these edges here, and you can see now we have 2 U shapes. Then I can shift left click these 2 edges and then control left click this edge here, and that's given us our third and fourth U. I can then press Control E
to open up my edge menu and choose Mark Seam. Then I can press A, U, and then unwrap, and right now you can see it's started to unwrap everything. You can see how our most prominent shape here has been successfully unwrapped. However, you can see our cylinders and things getting poked out are just being squashed down into 2D, which doesn't look very appealing. Now we've done that, let's move on to our second cube shape here. To start off, nice and simply, I'm just going to completely cut off this cube from the other one to make it easy to understand. So to do that, in this case, all I would need to do is press Alt left click, and that's going to select that entire loop there, but you can also select them manually as well. Then I'll press Ctrl E again and choose Mark Seam. Now when I press AU and then unwrap, you can see it's now separated out that cube shape, although it's kind of struggling to unwrap it. Then to finish unwrapping this cube, we just got to think about how we can get this to fold out. So we can maybe just select these 4 edges here by shift left clicking them like this. And what this is going to do is when I mark it as a seam, it'll be making cuts along these edges. And remember, there's a cut here, so there's nothing actually connected here in the 2D space. And that's just going to fold right open for us. So now I'll just press Ctrl E and choose Mark Seam. Then I can press A, U, and then unwrap. And now you can see we've got that cross shape. Alright, that's the 2 cube shapes. Let's go ahead and move on to the cylinders. At the front here we have this kind of more cone-like cylinder, which has a bit of a taper to it. To start off, we need to separate it from the cube. So I'm going to press Alt left click on this edge here. And then I'm going to choose Ctrl E to open the edge menu and choose Mark Seam. Then, if you remember how to unwrap a cylinder, it's very simple. We just need to select the edges on the other circle. So if I press Alt left click, you'll notice it only select 2 edges. So instead we can just left click one of the edges and press Ctrl left click and just select all the way around like that. Then we can either press Ctrl E again, or we can right click if we're in edge select mode, which is 2 in the keyboard in edit mode, and choose Mark Seam. Then I'm going to want to choose another seam to allow this to be flattened out, because if I press AU and then unwrap, you can see it separated that one face, but everything else is still being squished out, and that's because this entire loop of faces is all connected. If we were to be texturing this with a square based texture, then I would choose this one under here just to make sure it's in the least visible spot. However, if you're doing texture painting or texture baking, any one of these edges will be fine. However, I like to keep my options flexible, so it's just good practice to select this one underneath since it's the least visible seam. Then once I've got that edge selected, I can press Ctrl E again and choose Mark Seam. Now when I press A then U to open the unwrap menu and choose unwrap, you can see it's separated out these faces into its own island. Next up, let's go for this cylinder here. Now this cylinder is actually going inside the object. So to start off, we need to separate it from the cube. So I'm going to Alt left click this edge here, which is the one which connects it to the cube. And I'm going to press Ctrl E and choose Mark Seam. Then we can press Alt left click on this edge here. And you'll notice again, it's not going to select the whole loop. So instead what we can do is just press Ctrl left click to start selecting all of these edges around here. Then I can right click again and choose Mark Seam. Finally, I can choose this edge here and right click and Mark Seam. And the reason I've done that is because if I don't make a cut here, it's just going to try squash down these faces again because it'd still be connected. A bit like how I've done with this cylindrical object here. Then I'll press A, U, and then unwrap that as well. And now you can see things are starting to come together. Here's the island that is representing this little bit here. And we have circle, I believe it's this one here. If you want to check which one's which, you can turn on the arrows and you can left click deselect everything and then press L, and yeah, we can see it's that face there. I'll turn off the arrows for now, and I'm going to move on to the next cylindrical object, which is actually our final one. So this one, as you can see, is a little bit more complex because it has multiple layers to it, but it's not actually too difficult to unwrap. I'll start off by pressing Alt left click on this edge loop here, and then I'm going to press Shift left click to select one of our edges to flatten out faces here, and then I can press Shift Alt left click on this edge loop here, and that's our first cylinder. So I'm going to right click and then choose Mark Seam. Now when I press A, U and unwrap, you can see it's unwrapped part of the cylinder here, and this top face has kind of been distorted because we haven't unwrapped. For this bit here, press Alt left click here, then we can go ahead and just unwrap this cylinder like normal by shift left clicking this edge here, shift left clicking this edge here, and then control left clicking all around these edges. And then we can right click in edge select mode and choose Mark Seam. So if I now press A, U and then unwrap, you can see that's now unwrapping everything properly. However, you can see if I zoom in here, this has a big hole here, which could be a problem if you want to optimize texture space. Now we have a nice unwrap. However, you might not want these things rotated, in which case you could rotate them manually. Before I move on to that, first thing I'm going to do is press A, U, and then unwrap again. And the reason I've done this is because we forgot to set the margin. So in this unwrap box here, I can left click to open it. I'm just going to change my margin to 0.01. Also, make sure that the margin method is set to scale, as sometimes you might accidentally change it. That's
going to make sure everything has a gap between it by default. And yeah, that's how we would unwrap a more complex object.
Congratulations, that's you gone ahead and completed the first half of this course. If you're feeling a bit uncertain in your new knowledge, don't worry, this is totally normal, and it's a perfectly natural part of the process when learning a new skill to go ahead and recap certain areas. So please feel free to go ahead and have a quick refresher through any videos that you've learned so far in this Blender course if you feel like you didn't quite get something, or you just feel like you need a little bit of revision. But now we've gone ahead and covered the basics, let's go ahead and learn some of the awesome ways we can speed up our workflow for UV unwrapping, and some more essential skills to get some brilliant results when UV unwrapping and prevent things like texture stretching. Let's get started.
Today, I'm going to be showing you guys a quick tip to speed up your workflow when you're editing your object in edit mode once you've already got a bit of a UV setup. So what I'm going to do is press tab to go into edit mode, and if I left click one of these faces for example and press G and Y, you'll notice that my texture is just going to stretch horribly like that, and most of you probably won't want that because you want to keep the constant squareness. Thankfully this literally takes 2 seconds to change. All I need to do is left click this options button in the top right hand corner and turn on correct face attributes, and you can see here it says correct data such as UVs and color attributes when transforming. Transforming is just changing the shape of your object. I'll turn that on, and then I'm just going to press G and Y to move this along, and you can see that it now moves without stretching the texture. Keep in mind, if I press tab to go into object mode, when I now scale it on the Y axis, it won't work. So this is a feature for edit mode only. After the release of Blender 4.2, the current latest version, the developers of Blender have added a few new features, which can help speed up your UV unwrapping workflow. First one we're going to be talking about is edge slide. If you're familiar with modeling in Blender, if I press 2 on the keyboard to go into edge select mode here and select one of my edges in the 3D viewport and press G twice, you can see I can slide an edge like this. This works with vertexes as well if I press 1 on the keyboard and press G twice. So this is now a feature that we can use inside of the UV editor too, which is something which I was actually hoping they would add for a while. So I'm going to press 2 on the keyboard to go into edge select mode in my UV editor, and I'll select one of my edges, and I can press G twice. And you can see this makes things really easy to make some small adjustments. My favourite new feature though is the overlapping UV islands feature. Yes, I know in the last video I talked about how overlapping UV islands is typically a bad thing. However, there are some cases where identical UV islands you might want to overlap. For example, if I was going to texture paint this cylinder here, and I wanted the top and the bottom to be identical, then I would want these two faces to be on top of each other, so I'd only have to paint it once. This would be true especially if I was going to paint mainly in this workspace here, using the image editor workspace. So what I'm going to do is, if we remember, we can press L to select a linked island, and you'll notice here that it's going to select more than usual, and that's because we have these arrows turned on still. So we can just turn off these arrows and just press A to select everything in this menu here so we can see everything. Then I'll press L again in my UV editor to select just that one face. Then I can press G to move it, and if I want to overlap these, I can just press B, and you can just select one of the vertexes on your island which you're going to want to line up. So I'll choose this one here, and then we can just line it up with this vertex here. And now you can see we've easily overlapped our islands with just that quick command. Of course, we could use this magnet as well. However, this new B command is much quicker and easier since there's less settings to set up. And yeah, that's about it. Thought I would quickly update you guys on what new features have been added to the UV editor. Hey everyone, previously in this UV unwrapping series, when we've been marking a seam by selecting your edges, right clicking in edge select mode and then choosing mark seam, under options I can turn on this option called live unwrap. Now when I right click and mark seam, you can see it's automatically UV unwrapped it, so we can skip this select all, U and then unwrap. Of course I can keep going with this. I can then left click this one here and then shift alt left click this edge loop at the bottom here, and then press Ctrl E for the edge menu and then choose mark seam. You can see all I've had to do is mark seam, and it's UV unwrapped automatically. When we're unwrapping an object in Blender, to mark a seam, all we do is press tab to go into edit mode, 2 to go into edge select mode, and we can just left click the edge that we want to mark a seam as, or multiple edges, and we can then right click and choose mark seam, or we can press Ctrl E to open the edge menu, and then choose mark seam. This works just fine. But there's also a way to mark a seam as we click. In Blender, you can hold down Control and left click to select multiple, and you can see that would allow us to select multiple and then right click and choose mark seam. But alternatively, you can see here in the bottom left hand corner, a pick shortest path menu has appeared. That's what Control left click does. If I open this menu, I can change the edge tag to select to tag seam. Notice how now my selected edges have now turned red, indicating that they are now a seam. I could then go ahead and finish unwrapping this cube, so I could left click this one here and control left click, and now both of them have been marked as a seam straight away. And I'll do the same on the other side here, left click and then control left click, and now it's going to select all those and mark them as a seam. Then I could press AU, then unwrap, and then I've got my basic cube unwrapped. So yeah, a really simple but handy trick to speed up your seam marking process while UV unwrapping. Today, I'm going to be showing you guys how to unwrap multiple different objects into one singular UV map. This is useful if you wanted to, for example, bake a texture onto a few different objects, but have that all contained within one texture map, which would help you save resources in a game, for example. This might not be what everyone wants to do, but it's an important skill to know nonetheless, because sometimes it is important to know. So to do this, all we need to do is, first of all, go into edit mode with all these objects. To do that, we just have to have them all selected. So since there's only 3 objects in my scene, I could just press A to select all, and that's going to select all my objects. But if you had more objects in your scene, or you're not sure, then I recommend just left clicking your cylinder, and then shift left clicking your cube and cuboid. Also, if you want to follow along with this, by the way, I have a link to a file in the description, which will have these objects which have already been marked with seams, so you can just easily follow along and get this practice in. Then, now I've got them all selected, I'll just press tab to go into edit mode. You can see I'm now in edit mode with all of them selected. You can see I've got my seams marked already, so if I press A here, you can see all of our UV maps are applied over each other. So to have all of these separated out across the UV map, for baking or texture painting, all we would need to do is press U with everything selected, so I've just pressed A, and then U, and then choose Unwrap. And you can see it's now unwrapped everything together. However, we have a bit of a problem, and that's, for example, our cube here is really small, which doesn't make much sense, and that's going to create some issues if you want everything to be averaged out at the same scale, as it should be, because we've actually applied the scale of all these objects. The first workaround would be to join all of these objects together in object mode, and then unwrap it. Now unwrap everything at the same scale, because they're the same object. However, that's not really ideal because maybe we want to keep those objects separate. Instead, what we can do is come to our UV editor here and press A to select everything. Then we can come to our UV, and where it says average island scale, we can just left click that, and you can see now we have everything at the scale, which makes sense. However, everything's overlapping now, which is a bit of an issue. To fix that though is also very simple. All we need to do is, still with everything selected, I'll press UV, and there's an option here called Pack Islands. I'm just going to left click that, and here you've got a few options. Most important thing is you want to keep the margin method at scaled, and the margin I'm going to set to 0.01 and press Pack. A little progress bar will appear, and when it's done, it should look like this. You can see we've got all of our unwraps at the average scale. Our UV islands are also separated with a bit of a gap, which will allow us to prevent any overlap. And you can see it's also been packed closely together, which is good for optimizing texture space. And yeah, that just about covers it. A simple but very useful tip to know for UV unwrapping multiple objects. Today, I'm going to be showing you guys some cool ways to manipulate your UV islands here in Blender. So we know already a little bit about it if you watched my video on UV islands. For example, if I left click to deselect everything and press L over one of these islands, you can see I can select them, and if I want to move them, I just press G to grab, or I can press S to scale, and I can press R to rotate. So that is the basics of manipulating islands. But if I come down here, you can see I've got a few more tools. These ones here are just pretty much the same as what we've been using with hotkeys. So if I press this would allow me to move it like this using the arrows. So if you're more comfortable with that, that's something you can use. You've also got one for rotate and one for scale as well, and one for all kinds of transforms. Here I've got an annotate thing. This hasn't got anything to do with editing your UVs, but it's cool if you want to add some notes. For example, I could write this. There you go, now you know this is a UV. Then we've got this option called Rip Region, which essentially allows us to, when we select a vertex, for example, I'm just in vertex select mode, which is up here. Usually, if I come back to my select box option, which is the default, and press G, you can see when I move things, it's all connected like this. But this rip region, left click and drag to move it, you can see it's going to move it apart. Make sure not to press G here because that'll just access the grab command. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. If you don't want to rip region by selecting it, you can also press V, and that's going to also rip it apart like this. Then we've got this grab option, which is a little bit different from just pressing G. It's more like a brush, a bit like in sculpt mode, and I can just left click and drag, and this will allow me to move my UVs around. This looks pretty horrible, so I'll just press Ctrl Z to undo that. For some UVs, this will be a really handy tool. We've also got the relax option, which can be good if you've got some UVs which are maybe a little bit more squished together. You can see here though, it doesn't really have much of a use case. And we also have a pinch option. This will allow us to pinch some UVs together. So I could use it here, and you can see it's going to start pinching our UVs together here. If you want to change your size of your radius, you can just press F, just like with a brush, and that's going to increase the size, and you can see you can pinch things much easier that way. And also, for this thing at the top select box, all this does is it allows you, when you left click and hold, to select multiple things like this. But you're probably already aware of that. You can also left click and hold this though, and you can see there's a few other options. Tweak, for example, allows you to just left click and drag to move things like this. Then you've also got select circle, which is really cool. It's more like a brush. And then you can just left click and it's just going to keep on selecting things here like this. We've also got select lasso, which is a bit like the select box, but it's more flexible. See, I can go all the way around like this. It's going to select everything that was in that lasso. And yeah, that just about covers it. I thought I'd go over some of these tools on the toolbar here. You can see there's this option called cursor, and that's to control the 2D cursor. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a separate. Let's say, for example, I am manipulating my UVs. For example, I'll press L to select this UV island here, and I'm going to press G to move it. And I just want to move it to the edge here. But although it looks like I'm lining it up roughly with the top of the UV, if I zoom in, you can see it's actually gone outside of here, which means that there's going to be no texture on this part here, or it's going to be a repeat version of the texture. So how can we prevent this issue from happening? It's very simple. All I need to do is come up to this UV option here, and then I'm going to choose Constrain to Image Bounds. This will stop us from manipulating our UV islands outside of the boundary. So now when I press G, you can see it's first of all moved it back into the zone, and now if I try and move it out, you can see there's nothing I can do to move it out there. And yeah, that's just about it. Just a quick tip to help you prevent any issues when manipulating your islands manually. Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you an easy way to identify texture stretching to find out if we need to edit our UVs using a simple built-in texture. I'm going to left click my already unwrapped cylinder here. If you want to learn how to unwrap a cylinder, make sure to check out my video on UV unwrapping cylinders. And then I'm going to left click and drag up my timeline here. And where the clock is, I'm going to left click it and change it to shader editor. Then where it says plus new, I'm just going to left click it, and here it's going to add our basic principal BSDF and material output. We're not going to be able to see anything right now because we need to go into our viewport shading. So I'll left click it here, and right now it's going to display our object as black. This is because of the new updated Eevee in Blender 4.2 and onwards, which means we'll have to check a few additional settings. So I'm going to left click and drag this panel here to pull it out, and in order to change our material preview settings here, we'll need to go into Eevee since it uses the Eevee render engine. So I'll change from cycles to Eevee, then I'm going to scroll down to ray tracing, open up the panel. Again, this is Blender 4.2, so if you're in an earlier version, you won't need to do this. And then I'm going to left click the box to check it, and then I'm going to change my max roughness to 1 by just left clicking it and then typing the number 1. You can also just drag this bar. If you want to render in cycles later, you can just go ahead and change your render engine back to cycles, and you can see all the settings we changed in Eevee render engine have still been saved. Back to what we were talking about, I'm going to come back to my shader editor here, and I'm going to press Shift A to open the add menu. And under texture, I'm just going to choose image texture. Then I can simply press this plus new button, and here we're just going to call this UV grid. I'll keep the width and height at the default, which is 1K, and generated type, I'm going to change from blank to UV grid. Then I'll just left click new image, and before we even plug this in, we need to make sure it's using the UV map coordinates. If you want to see our UV map, I'm just going to press tab in object mode and press A to select everything. You can see that I've unwrapped this object already here. I'll press Shift A, and then under input I'm going to choose texture coordinate, and we're going to plug UV into vector. This is good practice because we're essentially understanding that we're needing to use the UV coordinate, which is the information from here, to tell this texture how to be displayed on our object. I'll plug my color into base color, and now if I press tab to go back to object mode, you can see we've got all these squares, and as long as these squares are squares, that means we have very minimal texture stretching. However, if I was to come into this UV editor and for example maybe press L to select this island here, and press S and then X to scale it on the X axis, you can see if I come to my bottom face here, our texture is very distorted. And to fix that, all we would need to do is straighten up this UV by pressing S and X again. And now that's allowed me to scale it to roughly so it's back to squares again. So essentially, you want to try and make sure that this texture is made up of just these squares, because a square indicates that there is minimal texture stretching. And that means when you apply one of your actual textures, there's not going to be any hidden stretching which will make it look off, but you're not quite sure how to fix it. And yeah, that just about covers it. Hey everyone, when manipulating your UVs manually in Blender, it's important to try and minimize texture stretching sometimes in order to prevent any distortions in the 3D viewport. There are a few ways to minimize this, for example using the UV grid texture to look for any distorted squares in the 3D viewport, but there's also a way we can visualize things here in the UV editor as well. To see this, I'm going to left click and drag this to open up, and we're going to need to come to this overlays option here, which looks like two circles over each other. I'll left click the arrow, and here where it says UV stretch, I'm just going to left click this checkbox. The opacity here just allows us to see how strong this effect is, so I'm just going to keep this at the default, which is around 0.9, and you'll notice everything is blue, which is actually a good thing. That means there's pretty much zero stretching here. That is of course because the objects we've UV unwrapped here are very simple. In order to see any stretching though, if I was to left click one of my vertices here, I'm in vertex select mode, which is just this option here, and then press G, you can see as I move this, it's going to start changing colour, showcasing how stretching is taking place. You can see the colours will go more towards a green, then a yellow, and eventually it will get to an orange and then a red as it gets really stretched. So if you found something like this, that would be a sign that if you want to reduce the stretching, you can just press G and try and move it to a point where it's a little bit more blue like this. And yeah, that just about covers it. A quick tip to help you identify and fix any UV stretching to prevent any texture stretching in the 3D viewport. So today I thought we'd talk about the 2D cursor as a nice addition for our UV unwrapping series. So I'm going to left click my cube here, and I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode and press A to select everything, and we'll have our default cube unwrap, which comes with every cube you add in Blender. And here you can see we have our 2D cursor. Much like the 3D cursor, you can just shift and then right click to move your 2D cursor around, and you can also press shift S to open up cursor movement menu. So for example, I could choose cursor to origin, and that's going to return it to that middle point there. Also, if I press this button here to go into vertex select mode, and I'll select this point here, I can also move the cursor to that point by pressing shift S and then choosing cursor to selected. I'll press shift S and I'm going to return it to the origin again, although you might be wondering why this is even useful in the first place. And pretty much what this will allow us to do is give us some more options for moving our islands. For example, I'll press L to select my island here, and I'll press R, and you can see right now it's rotating around the center of mass, which might be what you want most of the time. But if I wanted to rotate it off a specific point, which I could control using this 3D cursor, I could change our point by coming up to here to this pivot menu and changing from bounding box center, which is the default, to 2D cursor. Now when I press R, you'll notice it's going to rotate around that 3D cursor, and this can be really handy for rotating around specific points. For example, I could left click this vertex here, press shift S and press cursor to selected. Then I could press L to select my UV island and press R, and you see it's going to rotate around that specific point now. This of course works with other transforms such as scale, for example. So if I press S, you can see it's going to start scaling from that point specifically. You can of course press shift S and then choose selection to cursor. I could also move individual points to my 3D cursor, so I'm going to return it to the origin first. So I'll press shift S and choose cursor to origin. Then I'm going to select one of these points and press shift S and then choose selected to cursor. And you can see I've easily moved that point to a specific point, and that can be really handy for getting precise edits with your UV editing. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. If you forget the hotkey, you can also use our side panel on the left here by left clicking this option here, and now all you have to do is left click to move your cursor around. But yeah, that just about covers it. I thought I'd go over a few use cases of the 2D cursor and how it might be useful for your UV editing work. Congratulations, that's you just gone ahead and completed this UV Unwrapping for Beginners Blender course. By completing this course, you've just gone ahead and put yourself way ahead most beginners, as many are too intimidated by UV unwrapping to even dive into this topic. But you've gone ahead and not just followed a single tutorial, but an entire course. So massive well done to you. Again, don't forget that it's totally normal to go ahead and recap and recover certain topics when learning a new skill, especially a more complex skill like UV unwrapping in Blender. So feel free to go ahead and recap certain parts of this course whenever you feel like you didn't get something the first time around, or if you just want to recap in order to get some revision in and really solidify your knowledge. There will also be some more UV unwrapping and texturing videos coming out on the channel, so these should really help you continue your Blender learning journey in this topic. But apart from that, I'd like to congratulate you again for completing this course, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this free Blender course useful, and that it either helped you learn UV unwrapping as a total beginner, or helped you learn some new tricks to speed up your workflow, and fill in some patches of knowledge in certain areas. Apart from that though, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next free tutorial or course. Take care.